Hello, my name is Brenton Diaz, and I'm a trauma therapist for newcomers and refugees, for people who have sought asylum in Canada, escaping terrible situations, war, violence, things like that. So people sit with me and talk with me and share their feelings and share about the traumas that have happened to them. I'm also a former youth pastor, and I work with my church denomination with my passion to equip the church at large to minister to those in our communities who are suffering the most. This is really the cry of my heart, or the mission that I really feel like I have, uniting my experience in trauma work with also my passion for the church, and having these two combined together to see our communities, our church communities, more equipped to work with people who've experienced trauma. In this series for the Peace and Reconciliation Network, we're going to be opening up various questions as starters to kind of talk about this idea, to explore it a little bit more, to understand how the church can work with trauma, with the suffering of people in our midst. Now, the church is familiar with suffering. We have a rich history of ministering to suffering and relating to suffering, and understanding suffering. It's deeply embedded into our theology and into our experience as Christians. And in fact, there's a quote here that I have. God had one son on earth without sin, but never one without suffering. So this is actually by Augustine. So we've had this idea about suffering so long in our church life that even our ancient writers have talked about it. There's another quote I have here from Nicholas Walserstorff, and it reads, "This, said Jesus, is the command of the Holy One. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." In commanding us to love, God invites us to suffer. So already I've talked about trauma to a certain extent, and we've also talked about suffering. But I wonder if we can kind of figure out if there's a difference between these two experiences. So what is trauma? What are we actually talking about when we're talking about this idea of trauma? Well, one definition I have here is that trauma is something like when someone has experienced or witnessed events so extreme, so severe, so powerful or harmful or threatening that they require extraordinary coping efforts. Another definition says that trauma can be seen as a state of physical or emotional shock, which may be a result of real, anticipated, imagined, or forgotten experiences or encounters. Trauma may occur at an individual level, a group level, and a cultural level. So there's many kinds of different experiences that we can have that we could be considered traumatic. Again, with these two definitions, you'll see that really trauma is just anything that is so overwhelming that it causes that sense of shock, or that sense of having to kind of trying to cope with this thing. And we'll talk about this later on, but trauma leaves an imprint in our lives well after the fact. So a lot of the things that people experience that are related to trauma can be something like war, violence, genocide, natural disasters, life-threatening accidents, sexual violence, and other kinds of abuse, as well as other things such as racism, oppression, and other kinds of pieces like that, including serious illness. So as you can see, there's all kinds of different ways that we can understand what trauma actually is. And therefore, if you think about the multitude of possible traumas that there are in our society, all of a sudden it broadens out this idea of what trauma actually is and who we have in our midst who are suffering with this. Now, how is trauma different than suffering or hardship? Now, we all go through difficult times in our lives, right? But we can't really be said to say that we all necessarily go through trauma, at least not in that clinical kind of a definition way that we read about. Trauma, for instance, it's an overwhelming experience that leaves an imprint in our lives, in our bodies, in the way that we think, in the way that we feel, and in the way that we relate to this world as well. That word trauma actually comes from the Greek word for injury. And indeed, it is very much that. It's an injury to our emotional life, to the way that we think, and actually also to our bodies too. This injury impairs our way of life, so that the trauma remains a huge theme in our lives, even after many decades have passed. So one of the ways you can think about trauma being different than hardship, trauma basically causes our survival instincts, or our survival kind of mechanisms in our bodies to kick into gear. The issue is that this survival mode continues well after the fact, well after that the traumatic experience has occurred. So that people who are said to be experiencing trauma, they're still in survival mode, even if it's decades later after the actual traumatic event has happened. Even after we've been brought into safety again, our bodies are still telling us that they're in danger. And this is the experience of the refugee population that I work with. I work with all kinds of folks who've fled war, who've fled genocide, who've been in horrible circumstances where they're being oppressed by the political forces in their countries. And they come to Canada where it's safe, where none of these pressures are around. We're not in a wartime setting here. There's no danger of them being oppressed by the government. And yet it feels like every day like they're still in that war back home, or they're still in danger of experiencing that genocide that they fled from back home. So even though they've been brought into safety again, they feel like they're unsafe. So in a future talk, we'll talk about how trauma specifically impacts us. But for now, it's helpful for us to think more broadly. And so I just have some questions for us here, just as an introduction to this topic in general. How do our churches relate to suffering and trauma? How do our Christian communities really understand these things? How do we articulate these things? Do we carry with us that sense, that rich history that we have, and that sense of suffering and trauma being something that's really common to the human experience that our churches are already really familiar with? Or is this something that seems kind of foreign or daunting, even though, again, it's part of our human experience and part of our rich church history too? Do we blame people for their traumatic experiences? When we hear of a trauma happening to someone, do we automatically jump to the idea of, well, what did they do to bring this on themselves? Right? Do we somehow blame them? Do we somehow put them at fault for it? Even though, in many, many cases, the person has no fault at all in terms of what they've experienced. How do we relate to people who are injured, whose recovery from their psychological injuries seem to be taking a long time? Like I said earlier, the whole trick of trauma, this is the way I talk about it with my clients, I call it the trick of trauma. The trick of trauma is that it makes us feel like we're still in danger when, in fact, we're not in danger any longer. And like I said, there could be people who are experiencing the sense of danger, the sense of lack of feeling safe for decades after the original traumatic event happened. And so, how do we relate to those people as a church? As a Christian community, how do we extend our love, extend our compassion to people who take a long time to heal? Now, some people are able to recover from trauma relatively quickly with help, and so that's a wonderful thing. But even with help, even with professional help, at times it takes a long time. And so again, this is something for us to search in our hearts. Do we really understand this, and how do we relate to these people? Do we get impatient with them when they don't respond? When we preach our messages to them and yet they don't seem to respond right away? How do we relate to people who are injured, whose recovery from their psychological injuries seem to be taking a long time? And how do we believe that God relates to suffering? What's God's stance on all of this? What does He think about all of this? And what kind of role does He want us to play? These are the kinds of questions we're going to be exploring in this little series that we've created. And, at the same time, we want to be able to speak God's love and healing into the lives of the people in our communities, the people who are struggling with things like trauma, people from various countries in the world that have just suffered so much, and now they're here in our midst. They're going to the same stores that we go to. They're walking in the streets. They're living beside us. And so we have, as churches here in Canada, we have this opportunity to be able to share God's love with them. So how do we begin to articulate this and understand this and think about it? How do we speak God's love and healing into their lives and create a setting where they can heal from their injuries? This is going to be what we're going to be considering in this series. So I look forward to walking you through some of this and just asking some questions and getting us to think a little bit more about this. I think it's really important because, we often hear in missions type settings or, we read in Christian books about ministry that our job is to go to the whole world and preach the gospel. and we have this wonderful experience, this wonderful opportunity of the world coming to us. And now this gives us the opportunity to preach the gospel. But how do we do that with people who are so wounded? How do we do that with people who might be really different than most of the other people around us? Well, we have this opportunity, so now's our chance to do it. So I look forward to doing this with you. God bless you.